because that's.
Do call him that. It's okay.
I call him Luis Pedro, but now he goes by Pedro alone because I guess he's a poet. I met him many years ago. I was spending
Alliteration.
I was spending a sabbatical in Guatemala, and I got to teach a couple of courses back in my alma mater, and Pedro was one of the students in the algebra class I taught at that time, and then students in that university always have to write an undergraduate thesis. So I ended up being his advisor for the undergraduate thesis, and I started working on him to bring him to Ohio University, and I was very happy that he did, but we didn't get to keep him very long. After 1 year, he had been accepted by a very reputable PhD program elsewhere, and so he left us. But we have continued in touch, and his friendship is very valuable to me. He's a great guy to be in touch with. I enjoy his poetry. I enjoy his insights. He's also a wonderful soccer player. I, I was asked to include this in the introduction, and so welcome back to Ohio University, Pedro Poitevin, and it is your chance to do the talking, please.
Thank you so much, Sergio. It's an honor to be back, even if virtually this time. And I spent a wonderful year at Ohio, as you know, and I am very, very, very happy to be back. Today I come to you not as a mathematician, but rather as a practicing poet, and it is as a poet with a mathematical sensibility that I will deliver this colloquium talk. I hope that you can. I've shared the screen. Is it seeable? Like, can you see it? Yep. I hope that you will forgive me for not having any original theorems in the talk, let alone any proofs. If I were to give a talk with theorems and proofs, I would speak on Orlik lattices or Nakano spaces or something in some topic in functional analysis or in model theory, the two areas in mathematics that I feel the most at home in. But today's talk is going to be a little bit more uncomfortably speculative and slightly more philosophical than mathematical. I will give examples that guide some of the intuitions I have about the relationship between poetry and mathematics. And I will try to communicate these intuitions, and I will give a guided tour of some strange aspects of contemporary poetry and some aesthetic affinities between poets and mathematicians' minds. The talk is divided into 8 sections. The final sections are a little bit short, so you shouldn't panic if I haven't gotten to the final sections, but when it's about time to finish. I'll begin with some contrasts. Everybody knows that there are significant contrasts between mathematics and poetry. To simplify things a little bit, functionally, mathematicians are Platonists. We act as though the objects that we work with have some sort of existence, and that has the effect of framing mathematicians' findings as discoveries. On the other hand, poets are very comfortable with the notion that they are inventors, not discoverers. The very word poetry comes from the Greek poiesis, which means something like making something or creation. Another more significant contrast stems from the fact that mathematics, the informal language that mathematicians use to communicate with each other about mathematics, is designed to banish ambiguity to the extent that that is possible when it doesn't conflict with readability and ease of understanding. But poets, on the other hand, actively pursue ambiguity. even when the highest compliment that you could possibly give a poet is to say that his or her lines are are descriptively precise. So precision is very valued in poetry, just as it is in mathematics. Good poets are always on the lookout for ambiguity, for polysemy, because a poem gains from the possibility of having multiple interpretations or multiple layers of meaning. There's a very famous quote that you can see here. In science, you want to say something that nobody knew before in words which everyone can understand. In poetry, you are bound to say something that everybody knows already in words that nobody can understand. It's attributed to Paul Dirac, and it is a little cranky, but I think it actually captures an important intuition about poems, and it's that poems are hopefully some sort of non-trivial automorphism of the spirit, as it were, and that fix what we already know. So the things that we know are not changed, but there's something that stirs inside. Now, there are, on the other hand, some points of contact between mathematics and poetry, some psychological points of contact. To begin with, both poets and mathematicians are preoccupied with notions of truth. Now, mathematicians work with Tarski's notion of truth, and that notion of truth is very different from the notion of truth involved in the subjective experience that poets are interested in. But as literary critic David Lodge once put it, lyric poetry is arguably humanity's most successful effort to describe qualia, which is a word that philosophers in the tradition of phenomenology used to describe the introspectively accessible phenomenal aspects of our mental lives. When a poem feels true to people, this is a meaningful event. It's not just that the word truth is being used as an affectation by people who have envy for the kind of truth that we mathematicians work with. Now, another interest that unites poets and mathematicians is an interest in limit cases. Mathematicians derive deep insight, sometimes mathematical insight, from looking at limit cases. And the same is true of poets when they look at language, writing. There are limit cases in language, and poets derive insights from exploring those limit cases. More on this later during the talk. Another commonality is the enjoyment of constraint. And this might seem a little bit far-fetched to say at a time at which free verse seems to be the dominant mode of expression in poetry. But if you ask poets what kind of impositions they subject themselves to, you will find that poets are almost always finding footholds by embracing specific, if not easily detectable, constraints. I have a poet friend in Mexico, for example, who gets out of his apartment, goes to the corner of his block, writes a line on a notepad, then flips a coin twice to determine the direction in which he's going to walk, walks another block, arrives in another corner, writes another line. And this random walk poem, the random walk ends up informing the poem that is being written. The psychological experience of writing a poem can sometimes resemble, under some circumstances, the experience of solving an algebra problem. And under some other conditions, as I will illustrate later, it can actually resemble the experience of what analysts might call epsilon management. It's also the case that poets and mathematicians have an affinity for paradox. I believe it was Richard Welber, one of the greatest poets that the United States has produced, in my opinion, who once said, if you have something that you can say in 8 lines, and then you can unsay in 6, you have a sonnet. And this refers to the classical notion of the sonnet as a poem that in the first 8 lines deceives you into thinking that it is arguing something or saying something, and in the next 6 lines, it reveals to you that it was deceiving you all along, and that is actually saying something completely different. That's called a turn or a volta. In the Italian original, it was called a volta. In the Shakespearean tradition, in the English tradition, the volta can arrive a little bit later than the ninth line. In the Petrarchan tradition, it arrived in the ninth line routinely. Now, both the most important point of contact poetry and mathematics have, in my opinion, is how prominent in both of them are repetition and surprise. Both patterns and surprises, patterns within structure, surprises within structure, and surprises due to randomness, play a crucial role in the aesthetics of mathematics. And similarly, poetry is at many different levels about repetition and surprise. Now, the best framing for the deep connection between mathematics and poetry that I have come across is found in a review of a book entitled Strange Attractors, Poems of Love and Mathematics. It's an anthology of poems. And the review was written by the Nobel Prize winner J.M. Coetzee, who actually has a master's degree in mathematics from some university in South Africa. I don't remember the specific university right now. And he wrote the review and published it on the pages of the notices of the American Mathematical Society. He wrote, "There are a priori grounds for thinking of poetry and mathematics together as two rarefied forms of symbolic activity based on the power of the human mind to detect hidden analogies." And this is a deep connection. And just as at any point in time, arguably the best mathematical results are those which indeed detect hidden analogies or hidden connections between seemingly disparate mathematical fields or mathematical ideas, the same can be said of the relationship to poetry, to poetic ideas, poetic procedure, and poetic imagery. Now, I'm going to very quickly issue a cartoonish history of poetry from the vantage point of somebody interested in mathematics and its relationship to poetry. And one important consideration to begin with is to remember that poetry is prehistoric. It precedes the written word. And so it was you could think of it as a technology, a prehistoric technology for the storage, replication, and transmission of collective memory and collective myth. And because of that, meter was at the heart of poetry as it originated. Rhythm helps memorization, and poetry was very likely born as song. Of course, if meter is about patterns, and there's already a tenuous connection between those patterns of meter, metrical patterns, and mathematics, of course. Sorry about my dog Tarsky is barking for some reason. So repetition, that is to say, the repetition of patterns of stresses in utterances with a regular number of syllables, is there in poetry from the start. With the rise of writing, literacy, and later on the printed press, and even more literacy, of course, the poem eventually began to become less constrained by the strictures of meter, and one poetic gesture gained importance, the gesture of pointing. In my mind, it is as if poetry transitioned from being an orally regular way of conveying narrative to a visual means of drawing connections between images, feelings, and ideas. Now, it may be somewhat controversial to say this, but the most important word in all of modern poetry is perhaps the word "this." And this is because that poetry, that word points, and because poetry is in the mind of some of us the artful pointing, essentially. And because the word "this" is an arrow that never fails to point to itself, to the circumstances of its utterance, to the context in which it is written. Modern and contemporary poems, it seems to me, usually point to themselves or to aspects of themselves in some overt or oblique manner. Now, with the advent of the Ulipo, the workshop of potential literature originating in 20th century France, a dalliance between mathematics and literature began. The basic premise of the Ulipo is that embracing constraint is generative for literature in general. Systematic embracing of particular constraints allows the writer to approach writing as a form of problem solving. And this intellectual activity potentiates literature. I often think of Ulipian projects as figuring out what is definable in a restricted natural language. So recall that in mathematics, we say that our relation in a structure, in a mathematical structure, a group, a field, a module, is definable if it is the solution set of some first order formula in the language of that structure. Many of the words in the Ulipo are attempts at proving that certain literary results, like a novel, for example, are definable in somewhat constrained linguistic environments. Now, these linguistic environments are not first order, right? But they are more constrained than the natural languages in which they live. On this side of the Atlantic, a different movement emerged that has also shown in some of its manifestations an affinity for or an interest in mathematics, and this movement is known as conceptualism. I will discuss conceptualism a little bit later. For now, let me move on to a new section that I call mathematics as muse. Now, the first thing that people think of when one speaks of mathematics and poetry is poetry about mathematics. That's what we think of. And it is true that mathematics has been a muse for poets for a long time. In this section, we will see some ways in which mathematical considerations of very different degrees of subtlety enter into the consciousness of the poet and inform the way the poem is written. Consider the following sonnet written by Edna St. Vincent Millay. It's called Euclid. Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare. Let all who prate of beauty hold their peace and lay them prone upon the earth and cease to ponder on themselves, the while they stare at nothing, intricately drawn nowhere, in shapes of shifting lineage. Let geese gabble and hiss, but heroes seek release from dusty bondage into luminous air. O blinding hour, O holy terrible day, when first a shaft into his vision shone of light anatomized. Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare. Fortunate they who, though once only and then but far away, have heard her massive sandal set on stone. St. Vincent Millay was clearly fascinated by mathematics. I have some hard evidence of this. I visited her estate in Austerlitz, New York, while I was visiting my in-laws a few years ago. And during a guided tour of her house, I had the opportunity to explore her personal library. And I found, much to my surprise and delight, a book on celestial mechanics and several books on mathematics, including one on non-Euclidean geometry, among others. I don't remember the titles, but it's clear that she had a fondness for mathematics that matches the passion in the poem. I also want to notice how the line Euclid alone has looked on beauty bare appears twice in the poem. But of course, in the geometry of the poem, the second instance of the line is not quite parallel to the first, which is an interesting injection of tension between the postulate, the parallel postulate, and the theme of the poem. It is intentional, evidently. She's a very good sonneteer. Another example of what can happen with mathematics in poetry is this. This is a fib by Alicia Stalling. She's a master formal poet of our time. And this is just a fragment. It's very easy to read, and it does not have any reference to mathematics. Did Eve believe or grapple over the apple? Eavesdropping, Adam heard her say to the snake oil salesman, she was not born yesterday. And when you look at the number of syllables in each one of the lines, you realize that the number of syllables is determined by the Fibonacci sequence. It's a fib because it is a form that honors Fibonacci. But of course, the author was interested in the double entendre between fib for Fibonacci and fib as a lie, right? So that's where this comes from. But there you go, mathematics inspiring form rather than content. Now, I mentioned that I would return to conceptual poetry. And there are three important ideas from conceptual poetry programmatically. One is that context is the new content. So for example, there is a book by Bill Kennedy and Darren Wershler called Apostrophe, in which they curate the queries that they found on Google that initiate with the segment UR. So you enter into Google UR and you record what are the queries that people are making at a certain point in time. And that provides like a snapshot of the culture of Google users at a certain point in time, right? And that becomes the book. Now, as curators of all of these content, they are making very informed decisions about what the query should be and how they should present the results in the book. But they are exploring also one of the 4 limit cases of writing, which is this limit case of authorlessness, because they are curators of that content. They are not, strictly speaking, the authors of the content. The author is the culture. Another idea that conceptual poets investigate is that of the dictum, the desideratum that they have is that one ought to cultivate a thinkership rather than a readership. And another one is that one ought to replace the expression of the author, the authentic sentiment of the author, with an array of dubious poetic values like unoriginality, for example, that critics might think of as uninspired. So those are the 4 limit cases of writing that conceptual poets investigate. Now, I am only going to focus on constraint-based writing because that's the one that I feel is most connected to mathematics via definability. So we'll see what has been done in constraint-based writing. La Disparición is a novel by Georges Perec. It's a bit over 300 pages long and contains not one instance of the letter E, which is the most common letter in the French language. Legend has it that when a critic read La Disparición, he issued a review in which he remarked on the strangeness of the language, but he did not realize that the letter E was missing from the text. I do not know the veracity of that story, but if it weren't true, it would have to, I would love it for it to be true. It is actually very readable. Later on, and after an arduous decade of labor, Gilbert Adair translated the novel into English, and the result is A Void, which also does not contain a single instance of the letter E, also the most common letter in the English language. There is a particularly memorable version of the Edgar Allan Poe poem, The Raven, within the book, but it is titled A Blackbird. Meter and rhyme are preserved, but the letter E is completely gone. Let's see. Perec also wrote a short story called The Exeter Text that satisfies an even more stringent constraint. Every instance of a vowel in this story is an instance of the letter E. Perec quipped that he needed to do something with all the E's that were missing from La Disparición. Another Oulipian experiment that deserves mention, this one is strictly poetic, is Mille Milliards de Poèmes by Raymond Queneau, another member of the Oulipo, founding member. Queneau wrote 10 different versions of each one of the 14 lines in a sonnet in such a way as for any possible combination to flow poetically. And the result, of course, are 10 to the power 14 many sonnets. Closer to home in Canada, to be specific, Christian Book wrote Eunoia, a book of poetry in prose with 5 chapters, one for each one of the 5 vowels. Each chapter uses only univocalic words in the designated vowel, and it uses close to 100% of the univocalic words in the English language in that specific vowel. Another very impressive work of constraint-based writing is Stray Arts by Anthony Etherin, a British poet. I believe that Stray Arts and the soon-to-be published Slate Petals by the same author will be spoken about for ages in the future. They exhibit a mastery of deep constraint never before seen in the English language. So you see palindromes, anagrams, palindromic anagrams of palindromic sonnets. It's a celebration of virtue, also ability. And then I also want to mention that Robert Rapilly in French and I in Spanish have written 10 million palindromic sonnets. I did it to celebrate February 2nd, 2020, which is a palindromic date. I think Rapilly beat me to that date. And I can show you here, if I click, hopefully you will be able to see this. This is how you generate several of them. So this is one of them. It's a sonnet. It satisfies all the strictures of the sonnet, and it is a palindrome. And if you click, you get another one and another one and another one and another one. Of course, you can keep going. It is similar to the project. Of course, it's in honor of Raymond Queneau's Mille Milliards poem. Also, Anthony Etherin and I have worked on some bilingual experiments in which we adopt certain very deep constraints, and we write pairs of poems in English and Spanish that are in conversation with each other and satisfy those constraints. I've written a book called Ícaro hace piruetas en las nubes, which translates roughly Icarus pirouetting in the clouds, which contains palindromic poems. One of the things that I'm most proud of is that one of the poems in that book is going to appear in an anthology of poems soon, in a soon-to-be published anthology of poems, and the editors don't yet know that it is a palindrome, which I feel very, very happy about that they don't know that. I'm not going to tell them. And then I'm going to show you a fragment from chapter I in Christian books, Eunoia. So it reads, this is just a fragment. It's a very small fragment, but it reads as follows. Writing is inhibiting. Sighing I sit, scribbling in ink this pigeon script. I sing with nihilistic witticism, disciplining science with trifling gimmicks, impish hijinks which highlight stick sigils. Isn't it glib? Isn't it chic? I fit childish insights within rigid limits, writing shtick which might instill priggish misgivings in critics blind with hindsight. I dismiss nitpicking criticism which flirts with Philistinism. I bitch, I kibitz, griping whilst criticizing dimwits, sniping whilst indicting nitwits, dismissing simplistic thinking in which Philippic wit is still illicit. And what's remarkable about Christian Book's work is that not only does it succeed within the parameters of the constraint set it sets for itself, but that it does so with panache. In this chapter, Book is directing himself to the sort of critics who might decry his experiment as frivolous. And he pays attention too to the distribution of the sounds that the I letter makes in the text, which is very impressive. Another example is an alindrome. So this is an invention by Anthony Etherin, who decided to generalize the notion of a palindrome as follows. Given a sequence of digits, these digits determine the length of the block to be treated as a unit in a symmetric construction. For example, here, the sequence is 2, 3, 5, 7, 2, 3, 5, 7, 2, 3, 5, 7. So the initial 2 tells you that the first block is going to have length 2 in number of letters. So the initial block is AS, And that should be also the last block in the poem, AS. The second block is going to be length 3, so it's going to be IDE, and that is also going to be the second to last block, IDE. So every palindrome is an alindrome generated by an initial segment of the constant sequence 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Anthony Etherin has written alindromes based on sequences approximating special numbers like pi, e, square root of 2, and initial segments of interesting numerical sequences as well. This following experiment is a bilingual experiment that Etherin and I engaged in. We wanted to write 2 sonnets, one in English, one in Spanish, that would be in conversation with each other, and that would be anagrams of each other. So they would have to have the same number of A's, B's, C's, etc., the same distribution in letters in both poems. And knowing that this was the aim, I wrote an initial sonnet in Spanish about my wife's penchant for moving furniture around the house. So she likes to rearrange furniture. I am a very territorial animal, so it makes me very uncomfortable, but she enjoys it, so I put up with it. And the initial sonnet is about that. Then Anthony responded with a sonnet in English about the same topic, responding to my sonnet. And this second sonnet, and we checked to see whether the distributions in letters were somewhat similar, but they were very far apart. And that was because the natural distributions of letters in written text in English and in Spanish are very naturally very different. So in English, the letter W is far more common than in Spanish, where it never gets used. And the letter Q in Spanish is more often used than in English. So we had to engage in a process of a back and forth argument, essentially, producing pairs of sonnets, managing the error of the distributions until we got down to 0. So it was far more like an analysis process than a process of solving an algebra problem in this case, conversions in distribution. This is the nth pair, where n is kind of surprisingly large because it took a while. Now, the following is a more pedestrian sonnet, is about itself, and it tells you a lot of things about itself, and the statements are true. This sonnet has 10 sentences in all. Just 3 of them are in parentheses. It bids you, reader, be a doll and verify the truth of each of these. This has exactly 97 words. The ones that show up most are the and this. It says about its words, not quite 2/3 occur before the word analysis. This is 420 letters long. The one that shows up most is letter E. It comments on itself, nothing is wrong with my self-referentiality. Yet even after checking every box, this sonnet has a hint of paradox. Another example of something that math can do is generate new forms. This is there's a form in Spanish called the royal decima real, which consists of 10 verses, and each verse is essentially iambic pentameter, so it has 10 syllables more or less. In Spanish, there's an extra syllable that dangles off the edge of the cliff, so sometimes there are 11. The meter is very specific, and what I did here is simply add the requirement that there's an acrostic, so the first letters of the line spell a word. In this case, is the word in Spanish alucinante, which means amazing in English, and then the syllabic diagonal provides an eigenverse, that is to say, a verse that is additional. And of course, it refers to the fact that in a triangular matrix, you have the eigenvalues on the diagonal. Another example is the minimal decima. So in a bunch of poets were competing. We were competing for writing the smallest possible decima satisfying the strictures of meter in Spanish for a decima. And I had managed to bring it down to about 121 letters, which was pretty difficult to do. And then my friend Alexis Diaz Pimienta, a Cuban poet, started using numerals to to abbreviate words. So naturally, all of the incidentally, all of these decimas were referring. They all refer to the number of letters that they had. So that kept going in the exercise. And this is the smallest one I have been able to produce, which is a true statement about the number 25 using PEMDAS, and it is a decima. It has satisfies the metrical requirements of a decima, the rhyme scheme, etc. And now, for a more lyrical example of what can be done in poetry informed by mathematics, here's a poem by David Brooks. This is not the David Brooks from the New York Times. This is a poet in Australia, and the poem is called Yes. You know how just before we die, our whole life is supposed to flash before our eyes? Well, should that happen, we'd surely have, while it is flashing, to come to that moment when our whole life flashes before our eyes. And while that was happening all over again, we'd come again to that same moment, and so on. Which is only to say that while I know this might not have been good enough for Zeno, and that it's a certainty that death happens anyway, for that 1 minute when that thought came and I imagined living this life over and over, I said to myself, despite all the effort, all the pain of it, despite all that has happened and is likely to again and again, yes, I thought as I was watching you getting ready for bed tonight. Yes, though I knew even then it was crazy beyond measure. Yes, I would. Yes, please. Yes. And I have to confess that I am not a fan of love poems, but this one gets to me. And I think that it is because, first of all, it's a scene that's a very domestic, blissful scene, but it gets the sensation of love and thoughtfulness of the author for his loved one is enhanced by this infinite recursion and the repetition of the word yes and the repetition of the word again. It's structurally very well crafted, I think. Another example is this is a villanelle. A villanelle is a very difficult form because you have to repeat the first and the third line in a villanelle get repeated as the last line in subsequent stanzas. They get alternated as the last line in subsequent stanzas until the last stanza, which has 4 verses, and they come together. They finally meet. They have been separated all the while. And the real trick of writing a good villanelle is to manage to not make it boring by all the repetitions. You have to inject some kind of surprise for the reader. Now, this one I wrote attempting to hack myself in the following way. I wanted to describe what I would feel like upon reading the poem. And I am always a little bit shocked at how decent a job it does in describing how I feel when I read it. I feel the memory of writing you beginning to carve out its riverbed deep in the shadow of my passing through. How after scanning you beneath, I flew a little lower. How I turned my head. I feel the memory of writing you, my labyrinthine road. I had no clue how to begin or end before I read, deep in the shadow of my passing through, the story I demanded to be true. In each one of the knots along the thread, I feel the memory of writing you. The moment when I felt your pulse, I knew. And as you slowly found your form, I shed, deep in the shadow of my passing through, a love song to the love song that you drew with words I'd say, to words I hadn't said. I feel the memory of writing you deep in the shadow of my passing through. With that, we conclude the mathematics as muse section, and we ask ourselves if poetry has ever been a muse for mathematics. And there is at least one interesting example of a mathematical problem that stems from a consideration of form in poetry. It all begins with a form called the sestina that was invented by the poet Arnaud Daniel, a troubadour, a Middle Ages troubadour from the Middle Ages in Occitania, whom none other than Dante Alighieri regarded as the greatest poet of love in the history of the world up to the time of the conception of the Divine Comedy. In this short part, I will quickly sketch the story of the question that stemmed from considerations about the sestina. First, there's this is a poetically interesting cycle. It's a 6 cycle, 1, 2, 4, 5, 3, 6, and 6. That cycle generates the sestina. The sestina is a poem that has 39 lines. 6 stanzas are sestets, so they have 6 lines each. And then there's an additional tercet at the end, one more stanza that has only three lines. The ones that matter to us are the sestets, so there's 6 of them. Now, this cycle is an example of a spiral permutation. So let n be a positive integer. We define sigma sub n by specifying that sigma sub n of x is x halves if x is even, or n minus x minus 1 over 2 if x is odd. And that's a spiral permutation in general. Why it's called a spiral permutation, it gets illustrated by this, drawing. If you consider sigma 6, what it does to the first 6 words, the end words in the first stanza is the following. It sends the 6th one to the position 1. So 6 is going to be the first end word in the next stanza. And then following the spiral, you realize that 1 is going to be the second end word in the second stanza. Then 5 is going to be the third, 2 is going to be the fourth, 4 is going to be the fifth, and 3 is going to be the last. Just describes what the action does to the end words from one stanza to the next. And that's why it's called a spiral permutation. An example is the first 2 stanzas of A Sestina by Elizabeth Bishop. I'm not going to read it because it's 39 lines long, and I would just leave you wondering what's going to happen, because it's actually a very very well crafted sestina. But notice that coffee is the first end word, and it becomes the second end word in the next stanza. Crumb is the second, it becomes the fourth. Balcony is the third and becomes the last end word. Miracle is in position 4, so it goes to position 5. 5 goes to 3, and 3 goes to 1, and 6 goes to 1. So that process iterates, and of course, because it's a 6 cycle, because it has order 6, this spiral permutation sigma 6, the end words get permuted and they never assume the same position twice. That's why it's poetically a relevant permutation. Now, Raymond Queneau from the Oulipo asked himself the very natural question, sorry about that, ask himself the very natural question, what happens in general? Is it true that for every, well, I mean, for what values of n do you have a spiral permutation sigma n that has order n, that is an n cycle? And that question didn't give immediately. It took a little while for the question to give in. First, the French mathematician and poet Jacques Rouault, also a member of the Oulipo, along with his student Monique Bringet, studied this and made considerable progress on the question, especially Monique Bringet. And then in 2008, Jean-Guillaume Dumas gave a complete characterization as follows. If n is a natural number and 2n plus 1 is denoted by p, then n is a Queneau number if and only if p is prime and either 2 is of order 2n in C modulo p and n is congruent with either 1 or 2 modulo 4, or else 2 is of order n in C mod p and n is congruent with 3 modulo 4. Now, the natural question is, are there infinitely many Queneau numbers? And that is still an open question. In fact, it is related to a very venerable conjecture in number theory namely Artin's conjecture on primitive roots, which is here. Let g be an integer, which is not a perfect square and not equal to -1. And if you write it out as, decompose it as g naught times h squared, which with g naught square free, and denote by sg the set of prime numbers p such that g is a primitive root modulo p, then the Artin's conjecture on primitive roots says that S of G should be infinite and have positive asymptotic density in the set of all primes. And if G is not a perfect power and G naught is not congruent with 1 modulo 4, this density is independent of G and equals Artin's constant, which is displayed on the slide. It turns out that if one assumes a more general conjecture, namely the generalized Riemann hypothesis, which implies Artin's conjecture on primitive roots, one can actually pin down the density of the set of primes that correspond to the Queneau numbers. So these are the Queneau primes, which remember that a Queneau number is such that 2n plus 1. So if n is a Queneau number, 2n plus 1 must be a prime. Those are called Queneau primes, and we have the density of those in the primes with assuming the generalized Riemann hypothesis. All right, and another question is whether one can, are there other poetically interesting permutations? And the answer is yes, of course. And another question that one can ask is, can you generalize, poetically interesting question is, can you generalize Queneau numbers to non-integers? And the answer is, yeah, yes, you can. Here's, for example, a 3 1/3 INA. So it's in Spanish, but you can see that the end words get permuted according to the spiral permutation sigma 3. And an additional line is attached, indented beneath each stanza. And the last word, the end word of that line, that shortened line, is the initial third of the previous end word. So mar is a third of maravilla, sol is a third of solitaria, and ti is a third of timida, the initial third of each one of those words. Jacques Roubaud has written a 3.5 INA, and I have attempted a 5.5 INA, but it didn't really go very well. On the other hand, I've written a 14 INA, which was a very long poem that drained me of all energy during confinement. It was about quarantine. Now let's look at oblique self-reference, one classical result in mathematical logic. The famous Gödel's incompleteness theorem states that any consistent and effectively generated formal system in which a certain amount of elementary arithmetic can be carried out is incomplete. And so there are statements in the formal system that are true, but they are not provable. Now, let me be very clear. Poems are not formal systems, and it is almost inconceivable that arithmetic can be carried out by looking at the statements that a poem contains. So what on earth can Gödel's incompleteness theorem have to do with poetry? Well, the answer is that it doesn't have anything whatsoever to do with poetry, of course. But the process by which Gödel constructed the sentence GF that witnesses the incompleteness of F is emblematic of an aesthetic aspiration of poetry. In my sensibility, Gödel's construction is extraordinarily poetic. It engages in a very oblique form of self-reference. So the Gödel sentence is designed to refer indirectly to itself. The sentence states that when a particular sequence of steps is used to construct a sentence, that constructed sentence will not be provable in F. And however, the sequence of steps that Gödel specifies is such that the constructed sentence turns out to be GF itself. So in this way, the Gödel sentence states indirectly its own unprovability within F. And as it turns out, one non-trivial viewpoint in poetry criticism is that every poem refers to itself. even when you might think that this viewpoint is a bit arbitrary, unnecessary, perhaps reductive, you might embrace the notion that every poem at least aspires to refer to itself, or some other relaxation, weakening of that thesis. And it is always very interesting to see what happens when you approach the reading of a poem from the vantage point of view of that, from the vantage point of that thesis, even if you disagree with it. It is often the case that poems do refer to themselves, that they refer to the circumstances in which they come into existence, and that one detects oblique self-reference in, let's say, a dense subset of the set of plausible interpretations of a poem. And a particularly fun example of this is in Robert Frost's canonical poem Mending Wall, which begins with "Something there is that doesn't love a wall." And then it conveys a defense of the neighborly act of coming together to repair the wall between two properties. And there is some ambivalence toward the wall in the poem. And in at least one of three very rich interpretations of the poem, the wall represents the poem itself, and the reader and the writer come together when you are reading the poem. Besides, this ambivalence becomes even more manifest when you ask yourself after reading the poem, what is it that Frost refers to when he says something there is that doesn't love a wall? Everyone who has spent a few winters in New England will tell you that that something has a name, frost. Now, just this is the most speculative part of the talk, but it's very quick. We have seen mathematics as a muse for poetry and poetry as a muse for mathematics, and we have seen that oblique self-reference is possible, possibly one of the deepest connections between poetry and mathematics. But what, if anything, can the mathematical tradition of providing precise definitions do to help us understand certain aspects of poetry? I will outline a very timid approximation. It's more philosophical in nature, but it's rooted in this tradition of providing clear and definitions. First, recall what a structure is. And a structure is just a non-empty set equipped with a collection of relations and operations. So a group, for example, is a non-empty set together with one binary operation on it and a zero array operation that designates the neutral element of the group. A ring would be a non-empty set together with two binary operations on it and two zero array operations on it, one for 0 and one for 1. If there were no 1, it would be a wrong. I remember that from Ohio, from Athens. And an order ring has, in addition, a binary relation, the ordering on the ring. Now, as it turns out, poems are not nicely behaved, as nicely behaved as groups or rings. And in order to capture the structure of a poem, it is necessary to expand the notion of structure to the many sorted case. This is so because there is no single set of objects that a poem is about. A poem, from a structuralist point of view, is a collection of non-empty, poetically relevant sets, the set of words in the poem, the set of letters in the poem, perhaps depending on what the poem is about, of course, the set of end words in the poem, the set of images associated to the poem, etc., together with relations between these objects in these different sets. In order to capture this, it is useful to develop some terminology for when one has several sets as the underlying universe of a structure. And here we see a formal definition for a many-sorted structure. We're not going to stop and discuss those technical definitions, but just move on to an example that clarifies them very quickly, because those definitions stem very easily from the usual considerations. And a simple example is a left module over a ring. There are two sorts. There is a non-empty set M that corresponds to sort 1 and a non-empty set R that corresponds to sort 2. And there's some operations. And there's one operation that connects the two sorts. What are poems? Well, my intuition is that poems involve relational, many sorted structures. Poems are filled with arrows that point from one word to another, from a word to an image, from a distribution of sounds in a line and the image that the line points to some qualia, like when a poem's line alliterates heavily on the sound K while describing walking in a park full of crushed leaves. And upon reading it, we experience some feeling akin to sensorial recognition. That is what I mean when I think of poetry as the art of painting with pointing, a sort of architecture of arrows or a kind of archery. And final remarks: in AI poetry, it could be useful to use a reduced many-sorted architecture for understanding poems, so that AI programs would understand how to create complex relational poems. And a poem is far more than what emerges from its internal structure, because of course it's embedded in a cultural context, and there's a lot of arrows that escape its own structure. And with that, I conclude, and I thank you so much for this invitation.
Thank you so very much, Pedro, for a wonderful presentation. I am going to ask members of the audience if they have any comments or questions to share with you. Any questions or comments for our speaker?
I have a question.
Please go ahead, Archil.
Thank you very much, Pedro. It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. You spoke a lot about structural properties in poems and about mathematics as a muse for poetry and vice versa. But what are, in your opinion, the main differences between mathematics and poetry? Significant differences?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I have a lot of thoughts on that. Well, first of all, I think that the notion of truth is completely different, and the question of the banishment of ambiguity is very important. Mathematics is very precise. It's about making statements that are provably true in every possible world, right? And, or at least at least that's a first approximation about of how I think about mathematics. But poetry is not that, and sometimes I feel like this painting with arrows is it can be epistemologically problematic, like that you can very quickly get into situations where you resemble some kind of conspiracy theorist, because you're seeing a lot of connections between things that are not necessarily connected. You know, you're drawing with those connections, but your thinking is not as clear as that of the mathematician. Now, if you understand that what you're doing is playing with those connections, it's completely fine. But I do think that mathematics provides a clearer frame for thinking than poetry does. I do think that poetry has value in framing one's attitudes and one's perceptions.
Yes, but I agree with you. But in my opinion, mathematics and poetry, when you do mathematics or when you do poetry, it is a completely different way of thinking and feeling.
Yes.
But the question is,
yes,
if you are feeling yourself a mathematician, can it prevent you writing good poetry? Or if you are feeling yourself as more of a poet, can it prevent you writing good mathematics?
Good question. I feel that may not be the case, but I'm not the best person to posit I don't know. I don't know if it hinders your ability to do one thing of the other or the other. I do see that when I am thinking of myself as a mathematician, I am not going to go into any sort of poetic mode of thinking. My way of thinking about mathematics governs my mind, and when I am thinking as a poet, I am more permeable to even mathematical thinking, but not the other way around. Mathematics constrains severely what I can feel or think about the subject that I am working with.
Yes, go ahead. You were going to say something else, Archil? I interrupted you.
No, I said thank you, Pedro.
Okay. Well,
thank you.
I will let people ask more questions if you want, but before it's all over, it would be nice to take a group picture, which requires everybody to turn the cameras on, if at all possible, and then I just take a screenshot. Thank you so much. The audience grew while you were speaking, Pedro. So now we have participants from our English department. It's so nice to see you, Beth. And another participant from Ankara. It's nice seeing you, Pinar. Pinar is also a writer. You guys should talk because she writes literature and mathematics. And Jose Franco is another Guatemalan mathematician. So it's nice to see everybody here. So please, if you are ready, turn your cameras on and we'll print the screen. 1, 2, just something popped up on my screen. There we go. 1, 2, 3, go. Smile. Yeah.
Great.
And also the other problem is that when you're trying to communicate through Zoom and everybody makes noises, it just doesn't make any sense. So applause has become very difficult, but we do this at the same time and we can express our appreciation for the speaker. So thank you so much, Pedro. And anybody else, any more comments, questions, please?
I have a question.
Please
about very early on, you talked about the difference between kind of in mathematics discovering something that already exists versus poetry is kind of creating something. What do you think about the kind of overlap that happens in like very early discussions of mathematics in Greece, you know, a few thousand years ago, where they talk about both poetry as like coming from some outside source, as well as mathematics as something that already exists. Do you think that a connection there can be made about how viewing art as something that doesn't exist, that we make, but exists outside us, that we then channel, and the discovering mathematics as rules that our universe is governed by? Do you think that that cultural shift, or that culture would have viewed them as more similar, or that, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent question. I think that you would find that some classic scholars have mentioned that, yeah, the pre-Socratics, particularly in the pre-Socratic age, even for example, the framing of some of the philosophical texts of Empedocles and Parmenides are structured sometimes in verse, using structures, poetic structures that resemble the arguments being made, which points to some degree of belief in what you're proposing, that the muses are behind in that worldview of ancient Greece, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on in a completely separate world, the world of the gods. And that is a viewpoint that we no longer have. So it is a very foreign viewpoint these days. It would be very interesting to ask a classics professor to explain to us what exactly poiesis means, the Greek root for poetry in that original context.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
Sorry for taking your time. I have another question. Pedro.
Yes, no problem.
You mentioned you said an interesting word, marginal. Do you think that close between mathematics and poetry are marginal? There were so many great poets who were completely illiterate in mathematics, and vice versa, mathematicians who did not like poetry and did not know anything about it. So are those relations marginal? Are they a little bit invented for some reasons, or there is really a deep relation between poetry and mathematics?
Could you repeat that last part? I didn't make sense of it, but
no, I was speaking. I was asking you whether you consider real relations between mathematics and poetry a kind of marginal relations, in the sense that on one side there are great poets who were completely illiterate in mathematics, and on the other side, the great mathematicians who did not like mathematics and did not know anything about it. Mathematicians who did not like poetry and did not know any poems and anything in poetry. So are those relations of invented a little bit? Not really invented, but marginal, not mainstream relations.
Correct. I think they are. I do think that there is, as being a poet is already marginal in a culture, but being a poet within the community of mathematicians makes you even more, almost like fractally marginal. And being a mathematician amongst poets is also fractally marginal. But I do think that, yes, there are some cultural, probably sociological reasons why that is the case, and that there are, however, some, when I say deep connections, I don't mean robust connections, but hidden from view, right? Like very hidden from view connections, in the sense that, you know, you are symbolically manipulating languages, and one of the aims of that symbolic manipulation is to discover hidden connections between apparently very dissimilar ideas within the realms in which you're working. So mathematicians do that quite often, or at least we attempt to do that. Often we just get very surface level results, and we don't get that deep as the great mathematicians do. But in poetry, the same activity happens as well, that poets are attempting to find deep connections between dissimilar ideas.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Beth, please.
Yeah, I'm one of the, well, I'm both mathematically illiterate, but not a great poet. So I'm not going to put myself in either of those categories. But a couple of things that you, many things that you said that were wonderful about poetry. Thank you so much. And I actually am going to take, I think I'll take some of these forms back with me to my introductory poetry analysis course, just because there is a sense that closed forms have nothing to say to modern poets, which is clearly not true. But I think the thing that I liked best was the idea of a poet as a conspiracy theorist, which rings so absolutely true for the early modern British poetry that I specialize in, that it's a little bit eerie. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm pleased with that. Thank you so much.
Shall we shake our hands again for our speaker? And free everybody to go to have some dinner or to sleep if you're in Turkey. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Sergio.
Bye-bye. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Muy bien, Pedro.
Muchas gracias.
Estuvo
Muchas gracias por la invitación.
perfecto.